airplane behind me. Allow me to repeat the most important conclusions. Flight MH17 crashed as a result of the detonation of a warhead outside the aeroplane, above the left-hand side of the cockpit. This warhead was of the 9N314M type, carried on the kind of missile that is installed on the Buk surface-to-air missile system. As a result of the detonation, the forward part of the airplane was torn off. The airplane broke up in the air. The wreckage came down in an area of about 50 kilometers in the eastern part of Ukraine. The missile was launched from a 320 square kilometer area in the eastern part of Ukraine. In the period between 14 and 17 of July 2014, 61 operators from 32 different countries flew over the eastern part of Ukraine, where at that time an armed conflict was taking place. Malaysian Airlines was one of these operators. On the day of the crash, a total of 160 flights had operated above the area until the airspace was closed after the crash. None of the aviation parties involved recognized the risks posed to civil aviation by the armed conflict on the ground. In the opinion of the Dutch Safety Board, there was sufficient reason to close the airspace above the eastern part of Ukraine as a precaution. The Ukraine authorities failed to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, immediately after the crash of Flight MH17, it was clear that the Dutch Safety Board wished to contribute to the investigation and to the events. We also caught ourselves asking why the aeroplane was flying over an area where an armed conflict was in progress. That is why, one day after the crash, 3 of our investigators traveled to Kiev. In the end, dozens of investigators ended up contributing to the investigations conducted by the Dutch Safety Board. On the 23rd of July 2014, the Dutch Safety Board took charge of the international investigation into the causes of the crash. This was done at the request of the Ukraine authorities. 7 countries participated in the investigation: the Netherlands, Ukraine, Malaysia, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia and the Russian Federation. The efforts and expertise of all the investigators from the countries mentioned all contributed to the quality of the investigation and the report. After this presentation, you will be provided with the investigation reports containing all of our findings. Included with the reports is an animated video. I will be showing you clips from this animation today in order to further clarify the conclusions of our investigation. Ladies and gentlemen, why was Malaysian Airlines Flight MH17 flying over an area where an armed conflict was taking place? The question was on the minds of many people after the crash. The answer is as straightforward as it is disquieting. Almost all operators were flying over that area. And why? Because nobody thought that civil aviation was at risk. Firstly, the Dutch Safety Board investigated which operators flew above the area in the eastern part of Ukraine in the period between 14 and 17 July 2014. There turned out to be 61 in all. 61 operators from 32 different countries flew above the area. On the day of the crash, a total of 160 flights had operated above the eastern part of Ukraine until the airspace was closed after the crash. Every single one of those operators thought that it was safe. There was undeniable an armed conflict taking place on the ground, but above 32,000 feet, that is approximately 10 kilometers, the airspace was open to civil aviation. Nobody considered the possibility that civil aircraft at cruising altitude were at risk. In the Chicago Convention, the International Convention on Civil Aviation, it is specified that states are responsible for determining whether the airspace above their territory is safe. In the month before the crash, at least 16 military airplanes and helicopters were shot down in the eastern part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian authorities were aware of this. They stated that occasionally weapon systems were used that could reach the cruising altitude of civil airliners. Yet, despite all this, Ukraine did not close its airspace. Ukraine's position is that there was insufficient reason for closing the airspace above the eastern part of the country. We have, however, concluded that as a precaution, there was sufficient reason for Ukraine authorities to close the airspace above the eastern part of their country. The risks posed to civil aviation were not adequately identified, neither by the state of Ukraine nor by the operators, other states and international organizations. Our investigation has shown that all parties regarded the conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine from a military perspective. Nobody gave any thought of a possible threat to civil aviation. I would like to illustrate the route of flight MH17 up to the moment where the airplane disappeared from radar, as well as the measures pertaining to the airspace above the eastern part of Ukraine. For this I will be referring, as I already told you, to the animation.
In the early afternoon of July the 17th, 2014, a Boeing 777-200 of Malaysian Airlines departs Amsterdam Airport Schiphol for Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The flight is prepared as usual, and the aeroplane is in an airworthy condition. On board of flight MH17 are 283 passengers and 15 crew members. The routing of this flight leads via Germany, Poland and Ukraine to the east, a standard routing to Asia that many airlines use. Flight MH17 enters Ukrainian airspace at an altitude of 33,000 feet, following airway Lima 980. The crew diverts a short distance to the north to avoid some thunderstorms when returning to the airway in the eastern part of Ukrainian airspace. In this region, an armed conflict between the Ukrainian government and armed groups is in progress. Therefore, lower levels of the airspace are restricted for civil air traffic. Flight MH17 is routed above this restricted airspace when it is downed by a Buck surface-to-air missile. At that moment, 3 other commercial airliners fly in that same area. Immediately after the crash of MH17, the question rose how it was possible that a scheduled commercial airliner flew over an area that was known to be a conflict zone. The armed conflict in Ukraine progressively expanded to the air, and several military aircraft had been shot down in the previous weeks. According to Ukrainian authorities, 2 of these aircraft were hit by more powerful weapons that reached higher than before. But none of the parties involved made any connection between the military developments and the possible risks posed to civil aviation. On June 6, 2014, a Notice to Airmen, or NOTAM, was issued by Ukraine to restrict the airspace over the eastern part of Ukraine up to flight level 260. This was done to protect military aircraft from ground attacks and to let them fly at a higher level. On July 14th, the restriction was raised to flight level 320. Airlines assumed that the unrestricted airspace above this level was safe. Most commercial airlines continued their flights over the region. On July the 17th, until the airspace was closed, 160 commercial flights passed through this area. 3 other airliners were in close proximity of MH17 when it disappeared from the radar screens.
In connection with the investigation, the Dutch Safety Board has formulated a number of recommendations aimed at improving the safety of international civil aviation in the future. States that are involved in an armed conflict should put more effort into promoting the safety of their airspace. Other states, operators and international organizations will have to improve their risk analysis. Moreover, operators should be more transparent about the flight routes they choose. This will require changes to the international aviation regulations. Ladies and gentlemen, as you will be able to read in the reports, we have based our conclusion on several findings. An important part in this is played by the pieces of wreckage that we have recovered. Using these pieces of wreckage, we have built the reconstruction behind me.